Hey everybody, welcome to another U.S. History screencast. Today we're going to be talking about big business immigration, unions, and innovation. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. The goal is to at least hit this standard and every single substandard at least a little bit, so we can feel a little more comfortable about some of these standards. Just like you've seen in some of the other screencasts that I've done, I like to look back and then look forward. I think a natural kind of look back would be looking at the consequences from what we call the first industrial revolution, or some of you might use the term market revolution. So kind of looking back and seeing all the consequences, the antebellum era, and a lot of the connections that we'll see are kind of the same thing happen again in the late 1800s, early 1900s with the second industrial revolution. So I think this is just kind of a natural look back in time and sort of seeing some of the same things happen again. And then the whole idea about how people are going to react. So, that connection between the antebellum reformers, and then maybe you could link it to the progressives of that time period. Looking ahead, I think there's a natural connection between the post-World War II boom, and you could really even argue that it connects to today and whatever, number revolution you want to say that we're in right now, whether it's the tail end of the third or maybe it's a fourth with all of the new technology that we have today. And that whole idea of getting the conversation started, if you haven't already started it, all of these changes that are happening, are they positive or negative? And, which one actually, affects us more? Which one's more important, the positive or the negative? Now, before we jump deeply in, I think it would be beneficial to break down the standard in a way that the DOE is sort of illustrated to me that I actually really like. And what they were saying is to kind of break it into content, cognitive demand, and context, which some of us probably already do already, but maybe not in a systematic way. So let's just take a look at the one we're going to talk about for the rest of the screencast. And this is Standard 11, so examine connections between the rise of big business, the growth of labor unions, and technological innovations. So I'm going to keep that on the screen up there, but let's break it down piece by piece. So content, you've got a lot of what some people call proper nouns. So I just listed some of them here. Feel free to kind of pause for a second if I go too quickly, but I know everyone can read here. The cognitive demand is a little bit tougher. So this is, to me, feels kind of very sort of cause and effect, and looking at consequences, whether they be positive or negative. Where it says connections is the idea of the relationship between these things. So don't look at them as kind of separate ideas, but see how they interact with each other, and, do some things cause other things, or maybe one is an effect of the other. So look at them in an interconnected way rather than as a bunch of sort of mutually exclusive pieces of information. And then obviously context is huge. So I got a pretty long list here, but I think a lot of these are very, very important, if not all of them, to help us understand this time period and what's going on. So just something to think about if you feel like you are not getting your students to think about the context of the time period. Okay, so jumping into kind of pure content here, big business cannot happen without the rise of the railroad. So if you think about, whatever product or products you're selling, if you can't send it over a long distance in an efficient way, big business does not exist. You can only sell to the people around you. So this is a huge, huge deal. Now, once the railroads exist, you have the rise of, kind of these big business owners. And I like to present this, and I know a lot of other U.S. history teachers do this as well, in kind of the positive and negative light. So on the positive side, you have what we call the captains of industry. So this is kind of celebrating what these kind of individuals are doing, and we'll talk about two in a second with Carnegie and Rockefeller. But this is the more positive side of the rise of big business. And on the negative side, you have what we call robber barons. So this is definitely saying that these big business owners are kind of cutthroat and don't treat their workers well. So I honestly believe even in today's world, we're going to have this two sides to the coin situation where businesses provide jobs, et cetera, but then, are they paying minimum wage or maybe sometimes less than that? Or what are some of the arguments that we can still see today here? So let's just look at the two kind of bigwigs that are in the standard, and then obviously you could use this for anybody from the time period or even outside of the time period. So Andrew Carnegie, you've got sort of the positives on the right side. A lot of the things that we've heard about with Andrew Carnegie, he just gives away almost all of his money, and starts a variety of different things that are good for people. So you could present that to your students. And then obviously the robber baron side, where he creates a monopoly. The homestead strike, where essentially people die because he doesn't want them to go on strike. One way you might want to present this, you could even put these on little cards and sort of give them the two ideas of captain of industry and robber baron, and then maybe you could make them, put it underneath the proper category. So that's just something quick and easy that you can do. And then I won't spend too much more time on this because it's the same idea, except it's with John D. Rockefeller, first billionaire. A fun fact that you can put in Georgia is he actually helped start Spelman College. His wife's maiden name was Spellman, so kind of sort of named after his in-laws, if you will. So kind of a cool fun fact for Georgia folks here. And then you have the other side where, if you looked at the political cartoon at the beginning, it's kind of the tentacles of Standard Oil, not only going across the nation, but also into the White House or into the Capitol building. So same thing, you could just chop it up and sort of get students to put it in the right category, or just this could be just kind of a conversation starter. I think the easiest way to talk about immigration is through push and pull factors. And you can kind of start this off, get students to think about modern day push and pull, or use the time period. But obviously, even today, jobs, pretty much the reason why people come to a place, or why the United States pulls people in. Now, that also depends on the time period that you're talking about, but definitely during this time period, immigration and the rise of big business go hand in hand. Cheap land, so you could talk about the Homestead Act and, westward migration. And religious freedom, and then, this kind of introduces the push as well. So the idea of religious persecution, especially with many Jewish people during this time period. And then kind of the inverse, the lack of jobs. So, and you could add a lot more to this list, but this is just kind of main idea. But really, to sum it up, there's such a surge in immigration during this time period because there are lots of jobs, and people are trying to, come over to the United States and get a good job. Another effect of the rise of big business would be the rise of labor unions. When we talked about with the robber barons part, many of the workers were arguing that they were being mistreated or overworked or whatever you want to call it. And they realized that, if one person says something, they're just going to get fired. But if the entire factory, or if they rise up, then, somebody's got to listen to them. So the big example is obviously the American Federation of Labor with Samuel Gompers. That's the one that's in the Standard. You could bring in Knights of Labor, IWW. There's quite a few that you could bring in, but at the very least, I would talk about the one in the Standard with the American Federation of Labor. But definitely just get the students to think about why labor unions exist. Get them to think about if they have a job, if they were to basically stand up and say, I want a dollar more per hour, what would probably happen to them? But then, think about if everybody at the place that they worked at rose up instead, how would that be different? I don't know how many of your students work, but something to bring up for sure. And then definitely, just linking it back to the rise of big business, the whole idea is now that there are tons of people working in one spot, and not all of those people are treated in the best way. It's kind of a negative consequence, or you could argue it's a positive consequence of something negative from big business. Now, one of the positive consequences of big business is, everybody's trying to do the newest and best thing. So they put a lot of funding and money into essentially what we call research and development. So they're trying to get a leg up on everybody else. So a lot of these things wouldn't exist if it wasn't for that. So light bulb, telephone, elevator, skyscraper, radio, etc., etc. So you can have quite a long list during this time period. But the whole idea is, if we're looking at connections between big business and some of these other ideas, you could argue that big business sort of gives the money to these scientists and these people that are trying to make these innovations. Okay, so that was kind of just like a general overview. But now I always want to give you all an activity, because I know as teachers, you don't want to hear me talk about content the whole time. You want to know what this looks like in the classroom. So something that I came up with last year that seemed to work pretty well is this synthesis activity. And basically, I did this because I realized that my students were having a really tough time with chronology. So I kind of made this kind of makeshift timeline. And as you can see with the quadruple asterisk at the bottom, this is not a perfect timeline, but I did realize that my students love to see sort of more the big picture ideas, so they could put some of the proper nouns or whatever you want to call them in the proper sort of time period. It lets them see chronologically what some of the themes are, and then at the top, in my mind, for some reason, this is how I kind of put markers in history, is through the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, with the market revolution in the antebellum time period, not all of the consequences are positive. So, all of those reformers are trying to sort of change the things that are happening because of the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, the biggest one I always give is the cotton gin is a huge technological innovation that accidentally leads to a huge surge in slavery in the South. And one of the sort of equal and opposite reactions is the rise of the abolitionist movement. And then obviously, if there's more jobs, more people are going to come over from other countries to try and get those jobs. So with that first industrial revolution, it's mainly Irish and then a little bit of Chinese with the railroad. But then kind of fast forward to the one we're talking about in this screencast, kind of the same thing happens again. The progressives are now sort of looking at the downside of having urbanization and overcrowded cities and some of these negative consequences. And then you have a new group of immigrants, even though some of the same groups are there, but you have a new group of immigrants coming for similar yet different reasons. And then fast forward to, post-World War II, you have what some people call the military-industrial complex, but really that ties into just kind of manufacturing in general. And then obviously a lot of the sort of Cold War effects. You have the 1960s social reforms that come from that. And then the immigration has shifted from kind of Europe and Asia to not exclusively Latin America, but much larger numbers from Latin America. So hopefully this kind of helps your students see in the idea of industrial revolution, reform, and immigration all kind of going together. So hopefully that's helpful. And then what I do is I actually print this out and I give this to them, and then we do something like this. So I would get them to attempt to put this in chronological order. So you can pause the video right now if you want to and attempt to sort of be the student, but here is the answer. What I then do is get them to think about the larger theme. So what do all of these have in common? And what I was attempting to sort of get them to see is the idea of labor relations and how that changes, gets better, gets worse depending on the time period. And you could also throw kind of the government role in there as well. But this seemed to help my students last year. I did this as kind of like an EOC review, but really you could do it whenever you wanted. And let's do one more, so you can, like I said, you can pause and try this too. But here's the answer. So if you want to kind of guess the theme, you can probably, this one's a little easier than the last one, but the whole idea of technological innovation. And it's okay if they get some of these a little out of order, but it kind of helps them sort of visualize the changes that are happening all the way up to essentially modern day. To summarize, really the main idea here is getting your students to investigate the connections and relationships. So if we, go back to the standard, it's talking about connections. So that means cause and effect, or whatever you want to call it, these different relationships between big business and immigration and labor unions and technological innovation. So hopefully I've been able to show you that all of these are very tightly intertwined and definitely all affect each other in some way. So immigration probably wouldn't happen if there wasn't a bunch of factories for the immigrants to work in. Labor unions wouldn't really need to exist if all workers were being treated equally. And even though sometimes government can sort of fuel or pay for research and development, a lot of times it is big business that sort of drives innovation. And lastly, just getting to the idea of synthesis, the more that you can do this throughout the semester, kind of that looking back, looking forward situation, the better it will sort of build off itself. It's very cyclical in nature. It's just kind of like the face of whatever we're talking about looks a little different. So hopefully you can get your students to see that as well, and then you'll see a lot of light bulbs, no pun intended, kind of coming on there. Hopefully this has been helpful, and I thank you so much for watching.